Assalamu alaikum. It's good to be back again in class. We're going to be doing the second half of Francis Bacon's essay of marriage and single life. Before we go on to what we're going to do today, let me quickly go over some of the points that we did in the last class. If you remember, Bacon starts off with this very famous quote, "He that hath wife and children hath given hostages to fortune." And I explained to you how Bacon looks at it and how Bacon gives different explanations for the ideas that are prevalent in the minds of men. And he tells you in many different ways how people consider that having a wife and children is a great hindrance to any great work that you may have planned for. Let me quickly run through the slides that we did the last time. And in these slides, I explained that Francis Bacon's philosophy of life is governed by the conditions in which he lived and the age to which he belonged, and that is the Renaissance age. He served in the courts of Queen Elizabeth and of King James I, and as a seasoned courtier, he had certain points of view which were strengthened not only because he was a courtier, but also because he was a man of letters, a philosopher, and he dabbled into many different areas of arts and sciences in his day. Being basically a Renaissance man, most of his points of view are concerned with how they apply to men of his age rather than women. And one of the things that Bacon emphasized, and which I pointed out in the last lecture, was the fact that he reiterates in many different ways how men who are unmarried or married men who are childless have always done greater work than those who were married and had children. And this philosophy that he has evolved is based on his experience and the reading that he did in order to gain knowledge of all the different areas of life. So he says unmarried men are best friends, best masters, best servants, but not always best subjects. And the reason he gives for this is that a man who is unmarried, who is single, finds it easier to run away than a man who has a wife and children, because when you're planning to run away, it's easier if you plan for one person rather than for 6 or 7. And then he goes on to say that single men or married men with no children are always good as churchmen or as priests, because one of the pillars of Christianity is charity, and when a single man gives charity, he will be able to give more than a married man with children. And the example that Bacon quotes is that of a swimming pool, and he says that if a man is married and has children, his life is like a pool, and he must feed the wife and children before he can think of feeding poor people around him. So let's take up from this point of view, and the slide that we are dealing with right now is the one that concerns Bacon's views on unmarried men being best friends, best masters, and best servants, though not always best subjects. And he goes on to explain that a single man, if he wants to run away, there is not there are not so many reasons for him to stay in that place. He can just pack his bags and leave. And the example that he gives is that of fugitives, and he says that the majority of fugitives are single men, or if they're married, they do not have children. And then he goes on to say that as far as judges and magistrates are concerned, it does not make much difference whether they are married or have children or not, because it is indifferent for judges and magistrates. For if they be facile and corrupt, you shall have a servant 5 times worse than a wife. So the point of view that he is giving is that wives in certain areas, they have a tendency to make demands upon the men. And if you're talking about judges and magistrates, it does not make any difference whether they're married or unmarried, because judges and magistrates in any case have to be men who are incorruptible. They cannot be tempted by money or by the offer of a higher office. They are already in a position where they are more or less in charge of men's honor, men's lives and death. And as such, it does not make any difference whether a judge or a magistrate is married, unmarried, has children, or is childless. Now, when he comes to soldiers, he says that as far as the army is concerned, generals commonly in their hortatives put men in mind of their wives and children, and I think the despising of marriage amongst the Turks maketh the vulgar soldier more base. So what he's talking about here is the influence that women and children have on soldiers, and particularly soldiers of high rank. He talks about generals, and he says that having a general who makes you work is not very different from having a wife and children. And most soldiers, when they are confronted with a boss or a general or a commanding officer who is very hard and who is very demanding, it makes them think of the wife and children. It makes them think that their professional life is not very different from their domestic life, in the sense that the kind of demands that the wife and children make on the soldier, these demands are reproduced, they are replicated by the officer commanding or the general. Then he gives a slightly different idea, and this is about the Turks and the Arabs. And he says that perhaps the reason why Turkish soldiers do not marry is because they don't want to have too many demands being made on themselves. Now let me explain this a little further. When you say that a wife and children make demands on a soldier, the situation that Bacon is outlining here is that of a soldier who is in a low rank, and as such has a whole chain of command above him. Now, a soldier has to please his officer commanding. He has to do what he's ordered. There are no two ways about it. He has to do whatever he's commanded. He doesn't have his own opinion. He cannot object, he cannot refuse to do the bidding of his seniors. So the fact that Turks as soldiers are considered base, vulgar, uncivilized by Bacon gives you the idea that a wife and children are actually good things. You know, they keep you disciplined. They give you the sense that there is something more to an individual than the self. Now, for a soldier to be unmarried is to think that I am the only one who matters. I am the only one who is of importance. And therefore, I shall do what I please. Now, such a soldier will not be as ready to take orders, as ready to obey commands as one who has a wife and children at home. Now, the concept is not very difficult to understand. When you have a wife and children, then you have people who are already commanding you, who want your attention and who want you to do things in a certain way. In the absence of a wife, a soldier has no one to discipline him. A soldier does not have anyone to command him. So having a wife and children is like getting additional training. It's training in addition to what you already receive in boot camp, which you know is the place where all soldiers are trained. And one of the basic parts, or one of the most primary ideas that are put in the minds of soldiers is that they have to obey their seniors. There are no two ways about it. Whatever orders they get, whatever commands they get, they have to obey them. There is no concept of disobedience in the army. There is no concept of questioning orders that have been received. And the reason is very simple. Orders are meant to be obeyed. Commands have to be carried out. Let me give you an example. If you have a soldier who does not obey orders, that soldier will be replicated, will be followed by all the others around him. And you know what is going to happen in an army where the soldiers do not obey commands? You're right. Chaos, confusion. Each person saying, I think this is how it should be done. Each soldier saying, no, this is not the way we should attack the enemy, we should take another route. When you have personal opinions, then there can be no unity. And what the army needs above everything else is unity. Unless you have 100,000 soldiers united under one general, you cannot hope to successfully lead the army. You have to have unity. And one of the basics of unity is obedience. You have to obey orders. There are no two ways about it. This is something over which you cannot argue. This is something that cannot be debated. So coming back to Bacon's point of view, he says that the despising of marriage among the Turks makes the vulgar soldier more base. Now, soldiers are termed vulgar, and let me clarify one point here, and that is that the sense in which Bacon uses the word vulgar is not the way or the sense in which we use it these days. We use it to mean something that is that cannot be related. But when Bacon uses this as an adjective, he's talking about the common soldier. He's not talking about the officers. He's not talking about those who have received commissions. He is talking about the ordinary soldier, the infantryman, if you want to term it that way. The vulgar soldier, therefore, is the common soldier. And let me also remind you that this is one of the places in which you see that language has developed, the English language has changed. The example that is given here is that of the word vulgar and base. The word vulgar in Bacon's time just meant common. So anything that was vulgar was common, was normal. It wasn't anything special. So he's talking about the Turkish soldiers and the fact that they don't like marriage because they don't want to have two bosses. You have a boss at home, that is the wife, and you have a boss in the office or on the field, and that is your commanding officer, that is your general. So having two bosses is despised amongst the Turkish soldiers. But then that does not make the Turks good soldiers, since they are not trained to carry out orders by their wives. Therefore, when they enlist, when they join the army, they do not make good soldiers. They have too many arguments, they break out into fights, etc., etc. And that is an example of how a wife and children are a kind of discipline of humanity. And single men, though they may be many times more charitable because their means are less exhaust, yet on the other side they are more cruel and hard-hearted because their tenderness is not so oft called upon. Now, here you have a slightly different idea that Bacon is presenting. And that is, let's go back to the previous two slides. He says that a wife and children are a way of disciplining humanity, and single men are more cruel and hard-hearted. Now, we all know that married men or men who have children are always softer, kinder, more generous, because marriage brings out the best in a man. And when a man has a wife and he has children, then he has a greater tendency to think about other people, to keep in mind other people's considerations, other people's likes and dislikes, before his own likes and dislikes. Simply put, it means that married men, and especially married men with children, are more kind-hearted, they're more generous, they're softer. Because marriage softens you, marriage makes you realize that another human being has demands upon you, and you have accepted the responsibility of providing financial stability, of providing physical protection to that human being who is your wife. Now that's one human being. When you have children, when you bring into the world other lives, then your responsibilities increase. And it's not just your responsibilities. Your duties increase with your responsibilities. You have a sense of accomplishment. And because they are your children, you claim ownership. I'm not saying that they are possessions, because they are human beings. They are not lifeless objects. They are human beings, but there is a sense of ownership. And this sense of ownership is shown in many different ways. It is shown in the way you provide physically for your children, that is, give the baby milk and food, whatever age group she or he belongs to. And then you are also called upon to provide clothing as is suitable for their status and as it is suitable for your status. And you have to provide housing as the infant grows to babyhood and infancy matures into childhood. You have to put the child through school. Once you put the child into school, your responsibilities increase manyfold. And with the addition of other children, your responsibilities continue to increase. So he says that a wife and children are a way of disciplining men. There is a way of putting order into a human being's life. And although some people think that single men are more charitable, yet because they do not have a wife and children, there is a greater tendency to be hard-hearted, to be cruel. And here Bacon says that these hard-hearted men are good as inquisitors. And let me remind you again that Bacon, belonging to the Renaissance age, belonged to a period which followed a very bloody period in Europe, and it was during this period, that is the reign of Queen Mary I in England and Philip II in Spain, there was a massive crackdown on Protestants and Anglicans. If you remember your history of English literature, you will have studied that during the reign of King Henry VIII of England, the church split into two, and from being Roman Catholics, you have the Church of England coming up. And people who believed in the Church of England and who were known as Anglicans did not accept the supremacy of the Pope. And because Mary I happened to be a Roman Catholic herself, her reign, following that of her brothers and her fathers, was a time in which there was a crackdown on people who were not adherents to the Roman Catholic Church. And the Spanish Inquisition is a period that is notorious in European history, because all kinds of people were tortured to death, and those who did live had mangled bodies, had broken up bodies, because the inquisitors would think up different ways to torture human beings and to make them recant from their religious beliefs. The aim was to bring them back into the fold of Roman Catholicism. So when Bacon makes a reference to single men being hard-hearted, he is making a reference to the Spanish Inquisition, to the fact that Mary I, although she did get married, she had no children. So you see how it comes back to that. Because she had no children, she was hard-hearted. And the same was true of Philip II. He was hard-hearted because he had only himself to think about. Okay, so they're not as tender or as soft-hearted as men who are married and who have children. Grave natures led by custom and therefore constant are commonly loving husbands, as was said of Ulysses. And this Latin phrase, vetulum suam pretulit immortalitati, is translated into, he preferred his old wife to immortality. Now the reference that Bacon is giving here, and which shows how deeply read he was in the Latin language, is a reference to Ulysses, who was, and I'll give you a bit of background to the story of Ulysses here. Ulysses was one of 12 men who wanted to marry the most beautiful woman in this world, who later turned out to be Helen. And many of you will know her as Helen of Troy from the movie Troy, or from so many movies that have been made on this topic. So when Helen of Troy was abducted by Prince Paris of Troy and taken to Troy, Helen's husband, King Menelaus, called upon the other 11 suitors to help him bring his wife back from Troy. And this was because when Helen chose to marry Menelaus, the other 11 suitors, and there were 12 of them, the other 11 suitors vowed that whenever she needed their help, they would be there. Now, Helen married Menelaus, she settled down, and the other suitors also ended up marrying different women, different princesses, because they were all princes, they were all of royal blood. Years passed, fast forward so many years, and Helen gets abducted, Helen gets kidnapped and taken to Troy. So King Menelaus called upon all these other suitors and said, all right, now is the time for all good men to come to the rescue. Remember that promise you made when I married Helen? You said you would swear to protect her honor. Now Helen's honor is being compromised, my honor is compromised. I call upon you to help me bring my wife back. So Ulysses, like a good king that he was, kept his word and accompanied Menelaus to Troy. Now, when the Trojan War happened and ended, all those princes, those who survived, went back to their own kingdoms, went back to their own states. While Ulysses was coming back, he encountered certain adventures, and these adventures are recorded by Homer, the blind poet, in his Odyssey, because Ulysses is Odysseus in Greek. So from Odysseus he makes the Odyssey, and this is a voyage that is full of adventures. During the years and years that Ulysses was away, his wife Penelope, who was also a very beautiful woman, had many people coming to the court and saying, Ulysses is dead, marry us. And Penelope kept on thinking of ways in which she could put off those men. She was a very faithful wife, she was a very patient woman, and she wanted to wait for Ulysses. In the same way, Ulysses, when he was coming back to his country, was trapped by many different what you'd call supernatural entities, and these were entities, or these were beings that tried to take him away from his basic purpose, and that was going back to his country, going back to his wife. And one of those, during one of those voyages, he was promised immortality if he would but stay. Now that is an idea that needs to be thought about. You have two things, and you have to choose one. On the one hand, you have a wife who is very patient and who is waiting for you, and who has been waiting for years. And on the other hand, you're being promised immortality. Now that's a very difficult choice to make. And yet, Ulysses made his choice, and he chose to reject immortality. He chose to reject everlasting life and come back to Penelope, his wife. And you know, when Ulysses came back and he saw all those suitors in court, he slew all of them. And so, of course, they lived happily ever after. And when we talk about Ulysses and his wife Penelope, we definitely talk about chastity, because Penelope is known as one of the most chaste women in history, since she managed to keep all these different suitors at bay, and yet she succeeded in any kind of confrontation. She did it in a very diplomatic manner, and let me tell you another story here that is often told of Penelope, and that is that Penelope started a tapestry, and she started weaving, and she would weave the whole day. And what she told her suitors, those men who wanted to marry her, what she told them was that the day she completed the tapestry, she would marry one of them. Now this is also known as Penelope's web, because a tapestry is woven just as a web is woven. But Penelope was also a very intelligent woman. She wasn't one of those dumb queens. She was a very, very intelligent woman. So what she did was, during the day she would weave at this tapestry, and in the night she would unravel everything, undo all that she had done during the daytime, so that in the morning that tapestry was still not finished, the tapestry was still not woven. So she had to begin all over again, and those suitors meanwhile stayed at her court waiting for that tapestry to be finished. So when you talk about chastity, Penelope, that is Ulysses' wife, is always a very important mention. And Bacon says chaste women are often proud and forward, and they presume upon the merit of their chastity. Now here he is talking about a different kind of woman. This is not Penelope. Penelope did not go around saying, oh, I am a very chaste woman and I am very pure. She was a woman of the world. She ruled the kingdom, but she never made great claims of her chastity. So Bacon's idea is that women who are chaste are often proud of their chastity. Now, the two things do not seem to go together, because with chastity, you have a certain humility that is inculcated in your personality. But the chaste women that Bacon is talking about are those who are not only chaste, but who want to be known as being pure. So they are proud and forward. It is one of the best bonds, both of chastity and obedience, in the wife. And here again you have a reference to Penelope, who was not only obedient in that she waited for years for her husband, but she was also chaste. So according to Bacon, these two characteristics, chastity and obedience, are two of the primary virtues of a wife. And Bacon makes a slight alteration to this idea, and he says that this is possible if she considers her husband to be wise. Now, wisdom is one of the most important issues here, because a woman will never think her husband wife if he is jealous of other men, if he does not like other men looking at his wife, and if he doesn't like his wife to look at other men. Jealous men are very dangerous. They're not only dangerous, they are also unpredictable. So according to Bacon, jealousy will undermine wisdom. If a man is wise, he will not be jealous. In other words, a wise man will trust his wife, will believe in his wife. And such a man will always find his wife to be obedient and chaste. And these are two of the primary virtues in a wife. And now that we're on the subject of wives, we have some ideas which might be considered revolutionary, but let me explain how they become very realistic when Bacon puts them and he brings them to our attention. So he says, wives are young men's mistresses, companions for middle age, and old men's nurses. Let's take this bit and discuss this before we go on to what Bacon says about the time to get married. So wives are young men's mistresses, companions for middle age, and old men's nurses. Now, how does he arrive at this conclusion? A young man, when he marries, is full of devotion. He has certain physical desires that have to be satisfied, and for that he needs a woman whom he can call his own. So he gets married, and he takes care of all the woman's demands. Everything that she needs, all her needs and desires, are fulfilled by the husband. So that is one aspect. Now, when you reach middle age, when all those physical desires have sort of toned down, and you realize that that is not the only thing you want in this world, then comes the idea that you want someone with whom you can have conversation. So companions for middle age, you want someone who is with you and who shares the same interests, who has the same likes and dislikes that he has. So Bacon, when he says that wives are companions for middle age, he's talking about a gradual shift in the role of the wife. And the shift in the role of the wife takes place with not only age, but with the passage of time. When you first get married, you're very enthusiastic, you're very keen, you count the days that you have been married. And then time goes on and you count the months that have been married. And then you realize that you have spent years together. And so you start counting the years that you have spent together. And that is the time when you attain maturity. That is the time when a man realizes that his physical desires are not the only ones that have to be fulfilled. He has a mind also. He thinks. He not only feels, and mind you, youth is emotional. Youth is the period at which your emotions, your feelings are strongest. Middle age is the time when you start to think and plan. And so for your middle age, you need companionship. You need someone you can discuss things with, and someone with whom you can plan your old age, which, believe me, does not take long in coming. Age moves fast. Time moves fast. It's like you put the clock on fast forward, and before you know it, you are an old man. And what does an old man need? Not someone who can fulfill his physical desires, not someone who can provide him companionship. A little of that maybe, but most of all, someone who can take care of him. So, old men's nurses. Age brings disease. Age brings physical and mental weakness. Your tissues start to break down. Your bones are not as strong as they were in your youth. Your mind is not as sharp as it was in youth. So there is a gradual breaking down of all the systems, mental as well as physical. And that is the time when you need someone to take care of you. That is the time when you need a nurse. You don't want a beautiful woman. You don't want one whose mind is sharp and with whom you can have discussions and arguments. You want someone who will give you your food, your medicines on time, someone who will make sure that you have a comfortable place to sleep in, someone, in fact, who will look after your comfort and your health. So wives are young men's mistresses, companions for middle age, and old men's nurses. Now you realize how true Bacon's ideas are. And those of you who are young, and most of my students are young, you may not realize this now, but this is something that is going to hit you in, let's say, 20 years' time. That is when you will realize how true I was when I told you that Bacon's wisdom is not the wisdom of an empty mind. It's not something that he's taken out of the blue. This is wisdom that he spent years in gathering. Each word is like a pearl that has been stitched on to a beautiful dress. And when we talked about the different kinds of essays, if you remember, we talked about the expository essays. We talked about how there are types of essays in which a subject is discussed in great detail. And that's what Bacon is doing right now. That's how he deals with marriage and single life. He shows you that this is marriage and this is single life. And then he leaves it to you to form an opinion. So he's exposing both aspects, that of married life and that of single life. Let's move on. So as a man may have a quarrel to marry when he will, but yet he was reputed one of the wise men that made answer to the question when a man should marry. Okay, let me take you back to this statement. A man may have a quarrel to marry. Men might say they want to get married or they don't want to get married. That is not the issue here. What Bacon considers most important is that the man who decided when a man should marry was the most wise. And see how Bacon phrases it now. Now, the question is not whether a man should marry. Bacon has given you his ideas on that. All men must marry. And that takes you on to the question, when should a man marry? And listen to Bacon's answers. A young man, not yet. An elder man, not at all. Now, you might think that this contradicts what Bacon said earlier when he said that all men must get married. So what he's doing is he's exposing his ideas to you and leaving it to your judgment to decide what is right and what is good. So he says young men should not get married yet. That is, it's something that is not to be done in youth. It's not a decision that you make emotionally. You have to plan it out. An elder man, not at all. So, an elder man should not marry at all, because then the decisions that you make are either biased or your mind, your brain has become weaker and you cannot make the correct choice. And then he moves on and says, it's often seen that bad husbands have very good wives. Now how does that come to be? Bad husbands have very good wives. After all, the women may have chosen those husbands. Those husbands may have chosen those wives. If the husband has chosen the wife, he's safe because the wife is good. So what happens when a woman chooses her husband? Can she blame anyone if he turns out to be a bad husband? Does she want to blame anyone if her husband turns out to be bad? Now that's something that you need to think about. Let's see what Bacon has to say about it. He says, whether it be that it raiseth the price of their husband's kindness when it comes, or that the wives take a pride in their patience. Women are very difficult creatures, or at least that's what men say. And men say it because they have reason to believe it. One of the reasons is the reason that Bacon is giving here for good wives having bad husbands. You know, they always say that likes attract, and that is why if you have a good man, he will have a good wife, and if you have a bad man, you'll have a bad wife. But that doesn't happen. Science says that opposites attract. If you have studied a little basic physics, you will know that the negative pole in the magnet will attract the positive pole. The plus will attract the minus. If both magnets have like poles, they will repel each other. You cannot combine two magnets if the same poles are on the both sides. And you know the concept of a magnet is that it has a north pole and a south pole. So you have two magnets. Let's say these are two magnets. And this is the north pole, this is the south pole. This is the north pole, this is the south pole. If I move these two magnets like so, they will repel each other. They will not move towards each other. But if I make it like this, the magnets will join. The magnets will attract. So that's the kind of concept that Bacon is giving here. Now mind you, Bacon was writing in the 16th and 17th centuries. And see how current his ideas are, that likes repel and opposites attract. So he says there are two reasons. One is that opposites attract and that wives take a pride in their patients. Some women, sadomasochistic, those who like to torture themselves, seem to take a pride in the fact that they have bad husbands. And so they're like martyrs, you know, they make martyrs out of themselves. Oh, my husband is so bad, you know, he comes home so late at night, he beats me up, he doesn't give me money. Why would a woman say all these things? Because it makes her look good. If I go and say these things, it makes me look good. So I take pride in being patient. I'm suffering, but I suffer with patience, with a very sweet smile. Yes, he tortures me, he beats me up, he doesn't give me money. See what a saint I am. And that is what Bacon is trying to say, that women who put up with bad husbands do it either because it makes them look good, it makes them look like saints. If you have a bad husband, he's a devil. But the woman who puts up with that bad husband is a saint, is a martyr. So the whole world says, "Hi, bichari, she's so sweet, she's so patient. And look at that devil. Look at how he beats her up. Look at how he treats her." So she gets all the praise, she gets all the appreciation, and he gets the dislike, the wrath of the entire community. So that's one reason. The other reason is it raiseth the price of their husband's kindness. When the husbands are kind, and remember we were talking about the bad husbands, when the husbands are kind, it is appreciated all the more. When they are sweet, when they are considerate, then that consideration, that kindness, that sweetness is appreciated more. It's like if there's no darkness, you will not appreciate light. If there's no cruelty, you will not appreciate kindness. So this cruel man, this person who is a bad husband, when he is sweet, it's like the light shining forth. The period when he's a bad husband is the period that is the period of darkness. And when he is sweet and kind and considerate, then there's a light that shines through. And this light is appreciated because of the darkness that precedes it. And then another idea is, if the bad husbands were of their own choosing and against their friend's consent, then the wife will put up with the bad husband. Now let's see how this works out. You have a woman who receives a proposal of marriage and who talks to her friends, her family, and they all say, don't marry him. You know, he's a cruel, he's a womanizer, he's a drunkard, he's a criminal. And the woman says, yes, he's a bad man, but I shall reform him. I shall make him into a good man. And so, against the advice of all friends, against the advice of all family members, she goes and marries him. She not only goes and marries him, she tries to reform him. But he does not change. He does not reform. He stays bad. He stays a criminal. He stays a womanizer. He stays a drunkard. He stays an evil person. He stays a cruel person. So what is to be done? Admit defeat and back out of that relationship? No. It's a big fat no, because you will not accept defeat. Backing out of that relationship would mean that you are accepting defeat, that you are acknowledging that your friends, your family members were correct, were right, and you were wrong. But that's not on. That is not how things work out. You do not accept defeat. And so you continue with that relationship. And so you continue to suffer. You can continue to be beaten up. And that is what these marriages look like. A bad husband, a good wife. The good wife suffers, continues to suffer, will not tell anyone that he is bad, but will go around saying that he has reformed and that, you know, he's such a sweet man and he's so thoughtful and he's so appreciative, because it's a matter of her own ego. She cannot admit that she was wrong. So she goes around spreading false images of her husband, the only reason being that she will not admit that she was wrong. Because her friends warned her, so she had to do it. Because her family said, don't marry the guy, she had to do it. And so she continues in that marriage, which is not working out, but which she cannot back out of, because she has an ego that is about this big, and this ego will not allow her to admit that she was in the wrong. To recap what we've done today, we started off by talking about marriages and the kinds of husbands there are, and then Bacon took us slowly and gradually to the pros and cons of getting married and having children. He defined marriage, and then he went on to categorize married men. And mind you, he's only talking about the man's side of the argument, because not only is he a man, but he lived in a time when the world was really a man's world. And as such, he's only giving the point of view of men and how it benefits them to get married. And he gives different examples, and he says that married men are kinder, they're more considerate, they're better human beings because marriage disciplines men. And then he gives different ways in which they are disciplined. And he gives you this very interesting example when he says that there are some people who do not want to get married because they're the kind of men who would consider discipline to be cruelty. If you go back to that slide where he talks about girdles and garters being bonds and shackles. He's comparing marriage to clothes, to articles of clothing, and he says that men who are disciplined are better human beings. They're kinder, they have a more responsible attitude towards humanity. But some people just do not want to get married because they don't want to lose their liberty. They're so fond of their freedom that they are not willing to compromise that, and they consider that marriage is going to do away with that freedom altogether. So they think upon marriage and parenthood as being a kind of prison in which they will be put, and they don't want to go into that prison, so they don't get married. And Bacon says that that is not the kind of attitude that should be taken. Now this essay, being an expository essay, is a very good example of how Bacon not only exposes this entire issue of marriage and parenthood, but he also argues for the pros and cons of married life as well as that of bachelorhood. So what he's doing is not only exposing the entire topic, but he's also providing arguments in favor and against both ways of life, marriage as well as single lives. And he goes on to conclude on a very interesting note, and that is that it is very frequently seen that bad husbands have good wives. And then he says there are reasons why this happens. And the reason that he concludes with is that these are husbands that the wives have chosen themselves, and because it is their own choice and because their ego is involved here, they will never admit that they have made a wrong choice. Now, I think that that is enough of that subject, and next time when we meet, we'll be talking about a different area altogether, and you'll be able to see how Bacon is able to write on different topics which are of interest to different people, and he does it with equal dexterity, equal conciseness of style. So thank you very much for being very patient, and Allah Hafiz for now.